Hello all. Another thing to catch up on here. And you probably think I pick on people like Phil McKnight and Rick Beato, but I don't. I admire them, and I do sometimes pick up on some of the things they say because they have a lot of traction in the music community, and they often start little trends, little conversations that go around the net. And one of those recently was a video from Rick talking about the death of genre in music. And now Rick is someone who often opines about the state of the modern music industry. Sometimes he's more generous in his evaluation of the way it is today, and other times he seems to be, proponent of nostalgia, in that the glory days are gone and nothing today really aligns with what was done in the past. Now, this is something that I think people of our age, and I'm being broad here about our age, but anyone, say, above 30, 35, up into the 60s, lived through, either the 70s or the 80s or even the early 90s, which were eras marked by trends where we were all sort of subject to mass curation of music. We were all aware of what was breaking, what was going viral, what was gaining traction, what was becoming popular, what was starting trends. We shared in that experience. And then with the death of radio and the Clear Channel buying out and the streaming evolution, music is just fractured and everyone's sort of in their own little corner consuming, and we don't have that shared experience anymore. There's no one curating music in general, and for some that's a sore point. Now I think there are always pluses. Everything is always more complex than a plus or minus situation, and part of me shares in that nostalgia, particularly for the 80s. That was more my decade than the 70s. Now, some of you might laugh and go, well, the 80s had the worst music. It did, but it also had the best. It had a really solid underground scene in the 80s, and a lot of the genres we have today were defined in the 80s. So I think it deserves more credit than it gets in conversations. But there's part of me also that thinks that not having that sort of corporate curation and being able to go down rabbit holes all of our own choosing allows us to hear music that we wouldn't have listened to maybe in the 70s, 80s and 90s, where we were all sort of driven to certain points of listening that we shared together. So I think there are pluses and minuses. I think of all the rabbit holes I go down, all the music I listen to. Sure, I'm not sharing that experience with anyone. It's a very solo thing, but it's also taking me to music that I probably never would have found back in those earlier times where the medium of receiving music was more controlled. So I think there's a slight confusion in this conversation between the word genre and the word era. I think, yes, music has become generally more genericized, excuse me, but I think that genre still exists in certain pockets of the music scene, and some to exhaustion. For instance, if you are a fan of extreme metal, my God, there are so many subgenres, it's hard to keep track of them anymore. You hear a piece of music, and one of the YouTubers that do the metal channels, and there are many of them, talk about blackened crust death, core music, and it seems like you've got now sort of a everything has to be classed in its family and genus in a Victorian sense, to where you're over classifying music and the genres are almost hair splitting. I think you have that in electronic music as well, when you talk about glitch, dub pop, vaporwave. It's sort of an obsession with putting music so finely into a pigeonhole. You've overclassified it, and perhaps you've taken it out of the market for the normal person because you've overclassified it. But I think that only exists in certain areas. I think in general, music has become more generic. I mean, you consider things like rock. What is a rock music now? Well, you've got everything from early rock and roll, rockabilly, to this post-rock thing that is very vague. Same with country. Some of the new alt country, post-country sort of stuff doesn't even sound anything like country. Probably similar. You can say similar with jazz. And a lot of stuff is multi-genre anyway, isn't it? When you think of the successful albums of 2024, I'll pick one, Blood Incantation, their new album. It's death metal, but at the same time, it weaves in, sort of 70s prog electronic space music as well. There are flourishes of Tangerine Dream in there. There are bits of Vangelis in there. There's probably a little bit of Camel in there. Some of the early prog stuff in there. There's probably blackened passages with lots of, tremolo picking. It's hard sometimes to squeeze music into a single genre anymore because artists are genre hopping within a single project, sometimes within a single song. So I think what we've lost perhaps is the identity of certain eras. When you think of the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, they all have strong era presence. You think of punk, ska, new wave, new romantic, Canterbury prog, you name it. There are solid movements, solid identifiable traits of that particular era. You get into the 90s and you can think of trip hop, you can think of the grunge movement, you can think of the great industrial bands of that particular era. And then as you get into the noughties and move towards the 10s, slowly you can't think of those identifiable traits anymore. It's sort of like a dog's breakfast, isn't it? It's everything mashed together. It's become sort of an unidentifiable slop if you take music en masse and you think of it collectively. And I think that's maybe what we're talking about, is the fact that there is no focal point to today's music. It's very splintered. You got to go hunting for it. You got to go digging up rocks. There are many places to get it now. There's no sort of singular radio presence. There's no Top of the Pops. There's no Soul Train. There's no college radio anymore. It's all, you have to sort of go out and find it and dig it up. A lot of people don't want to do that, don't have the time to do that, don't think it's important enough to do that. So the conclusion they come to is music is crap today. It's awful. Because what they're assessing is the top 1% that they hear in popular culture, television, social media. They're not digging. They're not looking at the plethora of stuff that's available out there. So they've just already written today's music off. I'll go back to the 70s. I'll go back to the 60s. I'll go back to the 80s. Those of us that are willing to dig, and I include myself here, I need to have a diet of new music. So I seek it out. This is by no means any worse an era than any other. There's loads of independent music out there. Tons. There's loads of podcasts. There's loads of YouTube channels. There's lots of small labels. There's lots of little tiny scenes all over the place. All kinds of interesting music. There's some absolutely brilliant players. If we just stay in the guitar world, there are some unbelievable musicians writing music that's little heard, little known, because we don't have that collective experience anymore. It doesn't mean it's not there. It is there. You've got to go digging for it. And this is the problem we were talking about in the previous video, of getting your voice out there when there's no system anymore. by which everybody's sort of listening. There's no curation of music, a centralized curation. So yeah, it is an interesting discussion, and I think, you know, Mr. Beato is nuanced enough to see both sides of it, and not get trapped into the sort of old man's, you know, yelling at the clouds, although he's accused of that. I think that he puts out enough videos in support of modern music, although sometimes I criticize that he doesn't go deep enough into modern music. He looks at the charts or what's popular or what's selling a little bit too much for me. And if you assess each era by just what's popular, the top selling, none of the eras are that good. If you go back to the 60s and 70s and you only look at, say, the top 5% of selling artists, you're going to miss out on Led Zeppelin. You're going to miss out on you know, the Who records, the Kink records. You know, it's so limiting, and there's bad music in every decade. It's just that we have the power of retrospect to look back to the 80s and pluck out the good stuff. We look back to the 60s and pluck out the good stuff. Whereas when we assess today's music, we're just taking whatever schlock is out there and easily grabbable, and that's what we're using to compare to that good stuff from previous eras. So, you know, I would advise against falling into that. I would say you can't really judge an era until it's past, and then you can sort of filter it from the vantage of the future, can't you? We can look back on the 2020s and we can pick out the really, really, really good stuff and just, you know, bin the rest, and show how this is actually quite a decent decade. But while we're in it now, you know, it looks pretty hopeless, doesn't it, comparatively? So yeah, everything is always more nuanced than people want to present it. There's more gray area. There's more diligence in assessing music than people want to do. And I would say don't give up on today's era. Don't just assume that we're all post-genre, because we're not. There's so much genre melding and twisting and combining that's interesting. There's still people that are trying to create new music. It's harder because everything under the sun's been done. There's still people trying to give it their own spin, put their own stamp on it. And they're out there. You just got to find them. So I don't really have a central assessment for this video. I just thought I would talk about it because I find it titillating. I love talking about music and production. All right, folks. See you in the next. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think. It's important to me regarding music, genres, eras. Okay? See you next time.